let's get into it. Welcome to the Women IT Pros APAC call for May 2022. And because it's May, we are here to bring you a wrap up of all things Microsoft Build that might be interesting for IT pros and people who are not developers. As usual, my co-host, the amazing Jess Dodson. Say hi, Jess.
Hi, Jess. Yes, I am joining today. I have trawled through Build myself. Slim pickings this year, my friend.
Yeah, there was not a whole lot for the IT pro, and it was interesting to see both the book of news and Satya's keynote within the first two sentences mention the word developers very heavily. So it is what it is. But there are certainly some things that IT pros could benefit from being aware of in terms of announcements, and some other stuff that's sort of just generally pretty cool. So with that, let's get into it with the content. Okay, so first screen has that aka.ms/ms build link. That aka.ms short link will take you straight to the build page where you still can go and register. It's all free to access the content, and then you can get into the session scheduler where you can go through and filter for the sessions, throw in some search terms, try and find some stuff that's interesting to you, and access the stuff on demand that's been put up there as videos. You can go back and see sessions that have already played. So worth noting that it's still there, and you can go and find the topics that you're interested in the session scheduler. The book of news comes out every year after Win Ignite and Build launch, and this is the quickest way to get a good listing of all of the announcements that come out in this event. So news.microsoft.com, that link there. Now, because we are in a Teams call, all of these links should be clickable. So you should be able to go and hover your little mouse over that link and click on it and get straight into that link. Yes, clickable links in Teams. I love those. But this will give you, the table of contents down the side, delve into the areas you want with links to more information about each of the announcements. So it's a really good reference both for you or anybody else that needs to come up to speed quickly about what was talked about. Satya's keynote. And I've picked up a couple of highlights from Satya's keynote. Again, that's available on demand so that you can go and watch it. It surprised me when I pulled it up that it was only 44 minutes, and watching it on demand, I was able to watch it at 1.5 times speed with the closed captioning on to kind of breeze through some of the developer stuff. But he mentioned developer flow, which was kind of interesting. And from an adoption and a productivity perspective, we've spoken before about how being interrupted in the flow of doing the work you're doing makes it harder. So the little friction points when you're trying to do something and it's not working, or you don't have the right version of something installed on your PC, or whatever it is, those little friction points that make it harder when you're trying to get in the workflow of doing the work you needed. So developer flow was something that was on his mind that is covered in a couple of announcements. There was a little hero sort of case study about an Azure solution that was detecting damage on the gloves of astronauts in the International Space Station. So someone had developed an image recognition solution where they were able to do a visual inspection of these gloves and then use Azure's AI to analyze the damage to the gloves. And all of that processing in Azure was actually done on board some HPE hardware that sits in the International Space Station. So I thought that was kind of really cool, being able to take that sort of image recognition Azure capability stuff and not only not do it locally, but literally do it on the ISS on some local hardware. So kind of redefines the cloud, but
literally up in the cloud.
No, it's like the cloud in space. So that was pretty cool. He did a little mention of Windows 365, which I thought was interesting because it's not a big thing that we see in the developer space. And And also a shout out to Xbox Cloud Gaming. So Xbox Cloud Gaming is where we're using the Azure Cloud to live stream down gaming components like Fortnite so that you can play on any device. So you don't have to install the game on your Xbox console, and you're not relying on the processing power of the device that you're using with the cloud gaming streaming. So that's a really interesting one, because we've seen so many evolutions in gaming hardware, of course, with all the big gaming manufacturers bringing out their newer consoles with their greater capabilities. And cloud gaming might sort of tip that in a slightly different direction, maybe open the market for different devices and different device styles. Jess, what's your read on this, being a gamer?
I'm a little bit cautious. I see the direction that it's going. I think it'll be great from, like, particularly a game startup perspective. Exactly what Sin has said. For the US, I think it's going to be phenomenal. For us in Australia, with the pipes that we have, depending on where these things are hosted in the cloud, I think we could have a less than optimal user experience. So I think it will depend on how it's developed and how it's distributed geographically in order for the experience to be good for gamers. And gamers don't suffer high FPS lightly when it comes to their gaming. So yeah, I think that's going to be the trickiest hurdle to overcome.
Yes, it was kind of interesting to see that Fortnite was, I mean, obviously it has quite a large audience that would maybe want to be going out and testing this thing. But that particular style of game, as you said, is you're going to hear very loudly if there are issues with latency.
Very loudly.
Yeah. And the other things that he did mention in his keynote was Azure Confidential Computing and the availability now of some SKUs in Azure called DCSV3 VMs. They have a capability called Intel SGX. Now, that is a lot of acronyms and numbers, but in essence, the Azure Confidential Computing is about confidentiality and encryption at the hardware layer and in the memory space as well. And so this is a capability that was being trialed by a company and is now being released to public use inside Azure for those highly confidential workloads. So go and check out the keynote and find the little case study there about Beekeeper AI and anonymizing data so that the data can then be used by the healthcare services without having access to that personally identifiable information. So that was kind of cool. There was a hardware announcement. Now, I'm really interested in your feedback on how well this video is going to play and whether you get sound. So let's see how this goes. So there you go, Project Volterra. We don't often see hardware announcements at something like Build, but this is an AMD-based PC with developers in mind, little small footprint stackable units, lots of ports, and a neural processor as well for doing some really high intense workloads. I thought it was a cool little device. We've got no sort of, I think the time frame is next year. It's all pretty vague at the moment, but it was interesting to see us come up with a new piece of hardware.
Unmuting. I found it interesting. I like the fact as well that there's this focus on sustainability. So the way that they spoke about how it was produced and using sustainable methods. So I thought that was, for me, that was one of the more interesting parts. I'm like, yay, a new piece of hardware, something else we have to support. Woohoo! But from the perspective of the announcement, normally you wouldn't see something like that. But the fact that they're putting an emphasis on sustainability for me was really interesting.
Yeah, those recycled ocean plastics for the win. It's a really, really cool use case for sure. Okay, let's get into some more of the details. Azure Public MEC. Now, I haven't seen too much detail on providers taking this on board in Australia. It very much seems to be more geared towards the 5G telcos in the US for starters. But in essence, what they're doing is partnering with some of our telecom infrastructure providers to place some low footprint Azure capabilities close to their 5G network. So that was really interesting because it was talking about low latency across those 5G mobile networks into Azure, because you're not then traversing across the 5G network onto the public backbone into the Azure data centers. They're actually pulling together some of these Azure capabilities to bring them closer to those 5G networks. And yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting. As I said, I don't have any of the details of what that means in Australia, but yeah, that was kind of cool. Azure AI, Azure Machine Learning Managed Endpoints now generally available. So when we talk about managed endpoints, it's all about wrapping up some of the admin services that you would need to maintain an environment so that that's managed by Microsoft. So your IT pros have to do less work. Like, we like that. So with our Machine Learning Managed Endpoints, it's giving our developers the capability to use and develop machine learning models on a CPU or GPU heavy machine, but Azure and Microsoft takes care of the scaling, the security, the monitoring, the updating of those machines. This is the managed endpoint side of it. So yeah, that one's going to be interesting. And I think that this opens up a whole question, Jess, about where does IT draw the line? Because we've got into this situation where we want to give developers the flexibility to go and spin up the capabilities that they need in Azure to do their work. And then we also want to make sure, though, that we are putting some guardrails around that with governance so that they can't go and do stuff that's super expensive, so that we're making sure that the stuff that they're doing is secure, and we've got a whole, capability around that. This kind of takes that to the next level with these managed endpoints in terms of letting Microsoft do that stuff for us.
And for me, I love the way that they kind of focus this. So it's not like developers, absolutely, but coming from my biased view, from a security perspective, I got really excited about this because machine learning and AI and security is really big at the moment. So being able to utilize something like this, and I know a number of my customers have already reached out in some of the calls that I've had in regards to this, going, is this something we can take advantage of in terms of the machine learning around our threat detections and the threat intelligence we're getting? So I'm really excited to see how this would go. I'm interested in the guardrails around it. So I think, yes, there are some guardrails that are coming with it, but I still think I'm going to be interested to see more of the pricing around it. So one of the issues that I think, and I'm sure you'll be in the same boat, so cost management, something not a lot of developers think about. Bless their cotton socks. And so they're very good at spinning up things that can cost lots of money. So I'm interested to see from a pricing perspective where this is going to sit in terms of how freely we can offer these to developers to just spin up whenever they want.
Yeah, and I think that certainly the auto scaling has evolved to be able to scale things down when they're not being used. And people might have just, we have this joke that the cloud isn't about paying for what you use, it's about paying for what you forgot to turn off. And so I think the auto scaling and that certainly helps to also scale down as well as scale up. But I think you're right. And it would be good to see, I might see if we can investigate to get maybe a little bit more detail about what they are actually actually doing in that managed endpoint. It was kind of an evolution of what we went through with Office 365, where we'd been so used to managing Exchange and SharePoint online, and then Microsoft came along and said, we've got this service where we manage all that underlying infrastructure for you, and you don't have to do that. And we had to go through a process of learning to be okay with that, learning that we're not monitoring the servers to make sure that Exchange Online is performing okay.
And I don't know about you, but that was pretty hard to do.
Yeah, but also figuring out where the lines are in terms of what still is our responsibility for securing things and doing that kind of stuff in the M365 world. So I think, we'll see if we can get some more information on that. But that was a very cool little announcement. Now, another one that I don't have a ton of detail on, but it's hardware, like more hardware. Hardware is always good. IT pros, we love our grunty hardware. So Azure will be the first public cloud to deploy AMG's flagship M200 GPU for large-scale AI training. I went to AMD's website to try and find out some information about the M200 GPU, and I couldn't find anything. And it was just a kind of a passing mention, but it sounds like it's really cool, large-scale AI training. And the interesting thing about it to me is the fact that it's giving customers the ability to access these really super powerful computing resources for a short amount of time that they want to use them, for a specific AI training instance. And that is that consumer-based usage of a thing is a model that we've seen right across society and into cloud computing, where it would never have been affordable for me to go out and buy this kind of hardware before, especially if my business only had a use case to need it for a short amount of time. So yeah, more power.
More grunt. Give us more grunt. Again, I'm going to be interested to see the pricing on this one, to be able to see what kind of loads you're going to be wanting to run against this kind of hardware and where that pricing sits. That, I think, for me, is going to be the interesting part.
Yeah, and something like this is never going to be cheap. I mean, we've got some really expensive E-series VMs that, you can spend $8,000 a month in. But if you need that kind of computing power because of the modeling that you're doing, and we definitely have some industries that just need more power, who knows? Okay, Azure Cloud Native and App Platform, again, words you don't necessarily hear coming out of the mouth of an IT pro. However, Azure Container Apps are now generally available. And again, this is about microservices and containerized apps on a serverless platform. So let me explain that a little bit for you. I remember seeing the announcement that containers were going to be available on Windows, and I didn't understand all the complexities of it at the time, but it kind of made sense to think of it that if I had a container that had all of the things that were relevant to an operating system that an application would need, but because it's in a container, I can pick it up and move it so that I don't have to worry about things like DLLs or any of the other dependencies that an app might have on the operating system. That's kind of where containers fit. And so when you're talking about containerized apps, you'd be putting your app in a container instead of installing it on a server, for example. Microservices are very much the same in terms of writing applications where your code is executing steps and it's only firing when those steps need to run, as opposed to it being an application that's running in the background all the time. But when you deploy containers, you still have a level of container management, and the container infrastructure still needs to be installed somewhere, right? Jess will love that I've got the word serverless in there, because we all know that underlying there is tin, there is a server there somewhere.
I did see that. I'm like, it's always running on someone else's server, and yeah, so it is running, but at least we don't have to manage it. I think that's the point here. So it's the application itself and containerizing those applications. Like they don't even need to look after the container. They're looking after the application that's sitting inside, which I think is a fantastic way of doing it. And from a developer's perspective is going to be very powerful for them to be able to do things if their operations staff and IT pro staff gives them the ability to do so.
Absolutely. Okay, moving right along. Now, this is cool, and I'm sure that we've got some data people in the audience. So we also announced the Microsoft Intelligent Data Platform. I have got a couple of links there for you to go and have a look at it, but it's basically is this unification of databases, analytics, and governance across all the places you might want to be putting your data. And to me, this kind of mimics how, from an IT operations perspective, we're in this phase where we are trying to unify the tools that we use across Azure and on-prem for our services. And so things like Azure Arc or using Azure Policy in two different environments, for example. So this to me kind of is that, but on the data plane, where we may have data in different places, different platforms, but we want to kind of bring together the analytics of that data, how we govern them, and make sure that that their data is secure, and we've got data governance in place. So this will be an interesting one for our data people to dig into a little bit further.
And from my perspective, looking at this, again, looking at it with a security lens of being able to get that visualization, not just being able to get information and the governance over data, but being able to use the intelligent data platform to manage security related data, for me, is really exciting, and how this is going to tie in to some of our things like our threat protection platform, so Defender 365 and something like Sentinel. So I'm very keen to play around with this to see how we can ingest more information, because collect all of the things.
Love it. SQL Server. Now, this is a term you'll hear from IT pros, and we've got SQL Server 2022 now in preview. More for our data friends in the room, but the cool thing about this was the fact that for the very first time, anyone can download a preview of SQL Server 2022. So you can go to the link and test out the new features if SQL Server is your thing. That was pretty cool. And it's funny because SQL Server and Windows Server seem to be the thing that people think just keep running because they've been here forever and a day, and they do what they do, and they don't really need improving. So it's really cool to see that we've got a new version out, and a few things on that slide deck that will give you an idea of some of the updates and enhancements in this version of SQL. Have you done much with SQL Server, Jess?
I haven't done a lot with SQL, from the perspective of getting security information about who's changing things and who's got access to stuff. That's pretty much the extent of my SQL dabbling. I mean, I can write a SQL query from back in my uni days. For me, this one, I like the fact that it's tying into Purview. So giving us that access to the information and integrates nicely with that in order to be able to see what's going on, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, and the DR up to the Azure SQL Managed instance is really cool as well. And so as we saw with Windows Server, with SQL Server, we're now seeing a lot more of that integration into Azure to be able to use cloud capabilities when it's a fit, for example, like with disaster recovery scenarios.
And I'm liking that shift that we're starting to see, and I think you'll really be enjoying that. I know Oren certainly will be, that it's they now realize that hybrid isn't going away, that we're still going to have these on-prem systems that we're going to be needing to look at, and we want to find a way to help them work with the cloud rather than doing the constant competing.
Yeah, totally. Speaking of Azure hybrid, single node Azure Stack HCI is now generally available. So Azure Stack HCI is a solution from our hardware vendors where you can run Azure VMs and Azure Kubernetes services locally on hardware in your own data center or your own location, but it previously has required multiple nodes, and it was sort of designed so that you built in some local failover and redundancy. What they found though was that they were getting people who kind of liked the flexibility and the capabilities of running the Azure VMs and AKS locally, but didn't particularly need the failover and redundancy of more than one node. So they're actually allowing people now to run single node Azure Stack HCI solutions, which is it's an interesting move. I have thoughts and opinions about Azure Stack HCI. Yeah, we might just leave it at that, but any thoughts, Jess?
Coming from, I can see it from both perspectives. I think coming from that cost perspective and not needing to have that duplication and the redundancy and being able to have smaller nodes to be able to do that and be able to have just the solitary, I totally get it. From a security and compliance perspective, maybe not so much. I want that redundancy. I want to be able to have that resiliency in terms of what I'm doing. And I think my concern is what happens when something like this does go down and we end up with those first customers who are like, but I thought that it would fix everything. No, not so much. And that's probably my concern is when we start seeing those customers who start using these for that likely cost benefit and footprint benefit when there are resiliency issues. And that would be my concern.
Yeah, it'd be really interesting. It kind of goes into that pets versus cattle thing, right? Where we are so used to having to back up and protect a server because it's got data and applications on it, and if we have a failure, we normally need to restore back to a point in time to make sure that we don't have any data loss or whatever. But the other things that we're seeing, especially with things like microservices and Kubernetes and containers, is that some of these application workloads aren't the data store. And so if that application is doing the processing, but the data is stored in the cloud or the data is somewhere else, then if you do get some issues, it's not as hard to rebuild because you just like spin up another container or redirect people to the cloud or whatever. So I think it's hopefully going to force a lot of the more traditional line of business applications to think about how their solutions are architected. And we're certainly seeing solutions architecture from an application perspective move from these big monolithic systems into more sort of piecemeal solutions. So yeah, we'll see where it goes. Azure migration. Okay, more IT pro goodness. Agentless discovery and grouping of dependent Hyper-V VMs and physical servers to ensure that all the required components are identified and included during a move to Azure. So this has gone GA. I like this. I like the fact that the migration stuff isn't just going to have a nosy at the VM that I'm pointing it to, but it's also going to turn around and say, hey, do you realize that you have dependence on both other Hyper-V VMs and other physical servers to move all of that? And then also improvements to Azure SQL assessments, having recommendations for SQL Server on Azure VMs, and a whole bunch of other stuff like that in preview as well. And pause and resume of migration functions. So that was pretty cool. Providing control over your migration window. So you schedule migrations during off-peak periods, and that's in preview as well. So yeah, a few cool little new announcements from Azure Migrate.
I feel like such a naysayer. I'm always going, oh, but my concern is this. See, my concern with this, and I think it's brilliant. I think it's going to make life a lot easier for those people who are doing those migrations. But for me, a lot of the organizations that are going to be benefiting from this are the ones that are just doing full lift and shifts and not looking at how they can optimize their environments, not looking at where they can take advantage of containers and container apps and how they can look at SaaS applications rather than just picking up whole servers and shifting them up in the cloud. That's where I'm coming at it from. Sorry, I feel bad.
And look, that is totally valid. I mean, lift and shift has a place where, the application is just way too hairy to start diving into re-architecting it, but you still need it to keep the business running, and you just want to buy yourself some time until you can maybe go out and do an RFP to find a replacement or build a new application that you then migrate over. So I think customers are wary or should be wary of staying in a lift and shift model for a long time, but there will probably still be use cases where running your VM in the cloud still makes sense. I don't know.
Absolutely. And I'm a little bit sad. I just saw Glenn's comment. Lift and shift is all I've seen people use Azure migration for. Don't say that. Give us some hope.
That in essence is what Azure Migrate does, right? It migrates those on-prem workloads directly to the cloud without sort of giving you any more sort of ideas about what it would take to re-architect them to be cloud native. I had to get that term, and gosh, I sound like a developer. Developer tools. Okay, so these were cool. Now, we were talking a little bit earlier about how do you give developers access to do things with the tools that they need. without IT having to run around and look after it all, and in Satya's world also remove that friction in their workflow. And so Microsoft DevBox is like your cloud PC, so like your Windows 365 PC in the cloud, but in particular set up pre-configured for developers with things like Visual Studio Code and the different tools that they need. I've only just sort of dipped my toe into the water with some of the stuff that I do when I've needed Visual Studio Code, I've needed some extensions for VS Code, I've needed a certain version of PowerShell, or I've needed the Azure CLI, and all of that, once you've got it set up on your computer, is fine. But if you're going to rebuild, like you might have it scripted with something like Chocolatey to go and do those installs after you've done a rebuild of your machine. But this kind of gives developers the agility to have that coding environment ready for them, no matter which device they are coding from. So they can pick up a tablet, or they can, use another device completely and still have access to all of those things pre-configured that they need to do. The other one was Azure Development Environments, spinning up infrastructure with project-based templates with consistency and best practices. Again, something I would like a little bit more detail on. I haven't got into the details of what those templates actually have in them and what we're kind of enforcing here in terms of best practices. But we do mention security on this slide, Jess.
I saw that. So I haven't touched much of this at all, but the idea of a deployment environment and I like the way that they're focusing on best practices. I'm like, being able to give us something and have a deployment environment that is already baking in those best practices, so that they're not building on a greenfields environment and baking in poor security and compliance issues from the get-go. So getting all of that out of the box to me is very exciting.
Very cool. Yeah, Glenn thinks it's pretty amazing too. Identity, a couple of identity announcements, not particularly for the IT pros, depends on how far down the identity stack you go, but this was kind of cool. GitHub's OpenID Connect is now federated with Azure AD. So it's about making a stronger connection between GitHub's identity systems and Azure AD, so that we don't need to be storing secrets in places where they shouldn't be. Jess, this is probably way more up your alley with your security bent.
This is, and I know a number of customers that are utilizing GitHub as their repos. So having this kind of OpenID Connect with Azure AD and being able to utilize that is going to make their lives, I'm not going to say easier, but at least more secure, so that we're not storing secrets insecurely, and they're not having to utilize service principals in dodgy ways. I'll be interested to see how many, because part of the issue is that a lot of them already have that integration that they've got in place. I'll be interested to see how many move across to this now that it's available.
Yeah, totally. And I loved this one. I think out of all of Build, this was actually my favorite. And I didn't see it in Build per se. I actually saw it in a tweet. I think it might have been Alex Simos that tweeted this.
It was.
I
saw the same one.
Yeah, we now have a public preview of access reviews for inactive users in Azure AD. Gone are the days of going and disabling user accounts that haven't been used in 3 months or longer and waiting for people to call the help desk and scream because they can't get in anymore. That might have been a thing we used to do. So this is really cool. Both interactive and non-interactive sign-in activities are covered. So if you don't know the difference, interactive sign-in activities is literally where I go to sign in something and it pops up a box and I need to do something to finish off that sign-in process. Whereas our non-interactive sign-in activities are things like when I fire up Outlook already authenticates me in the back end to get access to my email, to bring my emails through to my Outlook desktop clients. That's a non-interactive sign-in. So it's really cool to see that both of those are included, and whether in the activity process. And yeah, you can go through and review those. This one's cool. Hey, Jess.
It is. And I love Paula's question. How does this work for someone on long-term leave? So I haven't delved into this. I, again, saw the same tweet you did and went, yes, finally, so many customers have been asking about this. But I'm pretty sure that there will be a way that you can exclude specific users. So people who are on, say, either long service leave or maternity leave for extended periods of time. I haven't played around with it yet. The big one there about the non-interactive sign-ins, that to me is probably the biggest call out. Most organizations that I've dealt with are going into their sign-in logs to be able to take a look at this, and they're only utilizing sign-ins, so those interactive sign-ins. The non-interactive sign-ins is where pretty much all of the work happens. So I see usually when using something like Sentinel to ingest those sign-in logs, non-interactives is like 15 times what we're seeing in our interactive sign-ins. It's huge. So being able to troll through all of that and you not having to do it, that Azure AD is going to do this for you, is phenomenal. I know so many customers who are excited about this one. So many.
Yeah, absolutely. And Melina mentioned in the comments that she thinks the key there is review and remove. And so even though it does say as part of this blurb that stale accounts can automatically be removed, there's obviously a process there that you can review those stale accounts and then choose whether you want to remove them or not.
And tied to that, I think things like dynamic groups. So if you've got a dynamic group set up inside Azure AD that has the ability to grab hold of, say, all of your extended leave people and have them in there, you would be able to exclude them.
Excellent. Power Apps. Now, there were a couple of announcements for Power Platform people. One that I don't have on this slide, which is a new capability called Power Pages, which is basically an easy little platform for developing some static websites using Power Apps. So that kind of, that was a thing. You know, gone are the days of me trying to figure out Microsoft front page and then turning it into HTML files and trying to wrangle it onto my IIS server. Yeah, Jess is laughing. I'm showing my age here.
I did the same thing.
Yeah, no, right. But the other cool thing is collaboration controls now in Microsoft Power Apps. So if you are doing any app development in Microsoft Power Apps, being able to embed Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Teams collaboration capabilities into your Power Apps. So chat, meetings, tasks, files and approvals, all of that kind of stuff. This one has me excited because of the number of people who work in a business who do a business process often and just wish it was easier. And I have seen people who get 15 to 20 emails a day with different attachments that all need to be downloaded and renamed and put into a file share. Like that sort of manual level of processing that people do in businesses all the time because they don't know that there's a better way to do it. They haven't had the time to figure it out and they've got no support to go and use technology to make their day easier. We're seeing a shift with people that are getting into Power Apps because Power Apps is our low-code, no-code platform, and we're seeing a greater uptake of people using Power Platform who are in or have come from a business role than from a tech role because it's so much easier for them to pick up without going straight into a coding editor. So the ability to figure out your business process workflow and to be able to bring in some of these elements like chat or tasks and approvals or files, this is cool. I think this is really going to make a difference to people who go and take this tool and start to do great things with how their business works.
And I agree with what Paul has just said, a lot of IT pros moving into Power Apps because we don't necessarily come from a developer background, but the ability for us to be able to do some of that automation inside of Power Apps and alleviate some of those pain points that our business or our customers have by automating some of that in a really easy way, I think that's going to be really cool to watch how new things are being done, how some of those new automation bits are done.
Does this mean we can get rid of the developers if we could go and develop it in Power Platform?
Oh, can we? No, I shouldn't say that. I'm sorry. We love you. We do.
Oh, dear. I'm kidding. We
Look
love
at
you
Glenn.
too.
Oi, love your devs. We do, I promise. It's said with love.
Sin's right. We were always told that everything was going to go to the cloud and they were going to get rid of the IT pros. So there was a little bit of payback.
I promise.
Oh dear. And before I lose my voice completely, Azure Skills Navigators. So I have a slight personal involvement in this project. We haven't seen a lot of promotion of it yet because we are scheduled to see some more promo in the next couple of weeks. But Azure Skills Navigators is something that Worldwide Learning and Azure Marketing are trialing to put together a bit of a better overview of different things to go and look at if you are new to learning Azure. And so we have an Azure Skills Navigator guide for the systems administrator and the solution architect roles. And they include some of the stuff that you might expect, like the AZ900 training, the Azure Fundamentals content on Microsoft Learn. But they also include things like the Cloud Adoption Framework, the Azure Architecture Center for the Solutions Architect, and then a few links on what to do next. And so how to keep connected into the community, where the particular spaces are on Tech Community, the Azure blog, that kind of thing. And there's a mix of learning materials in there, including videos as well as just Microsoft Learn content and docs articles as well. So a bit of an experiment for us to try and pull some of that stuff together. Go to those AKA short links and you'll be able to download the PDF that gives you all the clickable links into those different resources to help you on your Azure skills journey.
And I have already utilised the sysadmin guide a couple of times in passing that to some people who've reached out to me on email and LinkedIn and Twitter in regards to what can they do to get up to speed with being a system administrator in the cloud, in Azure. Where do they need to start? And the guide is amazing in the amount that it offers and the fact that it's self-paced and it gives you a lot of online resources. And it's not just learn content. There's white papers. It talks about certification paths and everything. It's fantastic.
I will pass on your feedback to the team.
I love it.
It's really great to know that it's been helpful. Woo-hoo. Awesome. This is something that I have not had the time to play with yet, but I'm really curious about it. So Microsoft Learn are releasing cloud games, and the first one that they've released is called Who Hacked. So it's a multiplayer game. You've got to go off and do your cyber security stuff. And as I said, this is the first cloud game off the rank that they are trialing. It's very sort of, that cartoon style and interactive. And I am not the sort of person who would have really ever signed up for a capture the flag because it feels like it's a lot more dev and codey and like not my thing. But this looks really cool. Have you had a play with these yet, Jess?
I haven't had a play yet, but I have signed up. I really want to get into this one, particularly because it's security straight off the bat. I'm very excited. So looking at it from that, it's a little bit of both. So there is some blue teaming, but also a little bit of red teaming, as you said, which I think is really exciting. I haven't played around with red teaming as much. So seeing that, but also seeing it gamified. So I think getting people in. So if we're looking at not just people who are interested in moving into cybersecurity, if we're looking at like getting high schoolers into some of these industries, this is the kind of thing that will work for them. So I'm really interested to see the uptick in the usage of these particular games and how many more they're looking at bringing out for different paths.
Yeah, me too. Looking forward to being able to spend some time to sign up for that and have a look at how that works. Sessions that you missed at Microsoft Build. I am not going to go through all of the IT Pro sessions, mainly because there weren't very many. And we'll leave it at that. However, Amy on my team has done a great tech community blog post called The Operations View of Microsoft Build, where she's pulled out a few sessions that she thinks you might be interested in. And some of them still are very developer focused. You're right, it was slim pickings to find IT Pro content this particular event, but Amy's got a great list there. If you click on the link, you can go and take a look at some of the sessions that she's recommending. And Rod Trent has also done a list of his favourite security content sessions and Microsoft Build as well. So if you're particularly looking for security, go and check that one out. I do just want to highlight too, one of them being a session on PowerShell 7. Again, they do talk about it for developers, but PowerShell is something that is near and dear to my heart as an IT pro for all the things that I need PowerShell to do for me on Windows or in Azure or Windows Server. And so there's a good session there to go and check out on PowerShell 7. And this one I thought was pretty cool too. Protect your databases using Microsoft Defender for Cloud. And so database protection is kind of a slightly foreign thing to me, but we have that capability with Microsoft Defender for Cloud, particularly for databases. So this is a really good session to go and look at for that too.
I've been off and I've taken a look inside of the security-based sessions. So for me, probably the big one that excited me the most is seeing developers get excited about building on Microsoft Sentinel. So getting our developers involved in Sentinel pieces and how we can utilize, and it sounds awful, it's like they're resources, but utilizing developers as a way of building some of the automation that we want to do inside of Sentinel. So bringing them along on our security journey. So that was probably the exciting one for me. I'm about halfway through watching that, and it's been really interesting to see Sentinel through a developer lens.
Yeah, and I've never really put developers and Sentinel together, but when you're talking about, I guess, the capability that you have with the workbooks and the capabilities that you can build, that's a pretty cool perspective. We're also seeing that a lot. If you go and have a look at any of the M365 content, there is a big push for developers to be building applications on Microsoft 365 and in particular on Teams and integrate their apps with Teams. And so there is a huge, big developer ecosystem for the M365 platform too.
I'm as you said, Build was very slim pickings. We had to pick what we could out of the small bits that were there. So I'll be interested to see what comes out of Ignite later this year from an IT pro, security, data, compliance, etc. perspective. That's probably where my excitement's heading now.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I can tell you, working for Microsoft Corporate, that with MS Build wrapping up this week, everybody will sleep the whole weekend and then go right into MS Ignite planning. So that is definitely the next flagship event off the cards. We don't have any dates yet. I don't know if it will be in person. I am not privy to any of those details yet because literally the planning has not started to ramp up, and it will now that Build is over. So watch this space.
And to be fair, I think you've been a little bit busy at the moment. So do we want to call out the fact that you have recently changed roles?
Thank you, Jess. Yeah, so I accepted the lead role for my team, the Modern Hybrid Infrastructure team in Cloud Advocacy. We've undergone a slight reorg at the corp level where we now have a security Cloud Advocacy team with their own lead, and I'm taking over the responsibility of the manager role of the Modern Hybrid Infrastructure team. But the best part about it is I still get to report to my wonderful manager, Rick Claus, as Rick levels up to be an M2 in charge of both myself and the security team lead, and Oren Thomas as well will report directly to Rick. So slight internal change there. I have led a team of peers before when I've leveled up to an M role. So unfortunately, this isn't new, and I'm inheriting an amazing team as well. So we're looking forward to getting our heads down with some financial year 23 planning and seeing how we can go and make a difference in the world for our IT pros next financial year. So I thank you, that it's all good. I'm going to pull out that Paula has a question in the chat about struggling with retaining knowledge for AZ900. So a game might help me to remember some of it. That's really interesting, and I think that would be a good use case for Microsoft Learn to look at with their cloud games, is sort of testing that more foundational knowledge. I know that when I study for an exam, it's a combination of doing practice tests. I make notes in OneNote. So in OneNote, I'll go through and I'll type in bullet points, or I'll paste in screenshots for particular things that I'm trying to remember. But AZ900 and most of our fundamental content very much is a memorization game. It's about knowing what one service does that another service doesn't, or knowing how things like service level agreements work, and just to get into a habit of typing up your own notes, reviewing them, and then going through and spending some more time in the areas that you know you are weaker at. And then just knowing, honestly, if you go and sit the exam and you don't pass, go and take it again. Like, it's not the end of the world. There are lots of people that fail those exams on their first try. So I just want to encourage you. Jess, have you got any study tips?
My study tips, I'm very much a hands-on person. So in order for me to be able to study something, I need to be able to touch it and play with it.
Yeah, I think Paula said the same.
I'm very much a break it and then try and fix it kind of person. And I think having things like the gamification is going to help with that for people who are those more hands-on style learners. I don't mind reading stuff, but again, it goes in one ear and then straight out the other. I'm not going to remember it, particularly if I'm doing like 3 things at once, which I think most of us are when we're trying to study stuff. So in order to be able to do a lot of those ones, the security one is a really good example. So the AZ 900 or the SC 900, is it the SC 900 is the other one? So the security one there. I think getting hands-on with a lot of the tools is really good. And I think the content we have in Learn that's available, because they do give you like mini demos for some of them. And I think that's really beneficial. The more of those we can get, the better it'll be.
Yeah, totally. And I just had to smile because the learning paths on Microsoft Learn for some of the content have been going through a bit of a refresh. And so the AZ900 content in Learn was the first time where we played with introducing little short intro videos into the learning paths in Microsoft Learn content. Microsoft Build has just seen the release of an updated SC900 learning path in Microsoft Learn, and yours truly is in the first intro video. So you'll be able to smile when you go to SC900 and you see Sonia do a little spiel on the opening of that. I was fortunate to be asked if I would do their first intro video, so that's kind of funny.
That's cool.
Yeah, it was cool. Awesome. We are getting very close to time. I'm actually surprised how much we covered at Build, considering the very heavily
slim pickings
developer content, but hopefully this was helpful. Now, if anybody asks what the latest news from Microsoft is or what was interesting at Build, you've got a reference to go back to. We've highlighted a few things that you might have missed from the conference that are going to be relevant to you. So anything you wanted to end with, Jess?
No, nothing from me. I think you're right. I think it's been one of those frantic kind of push towards this part. I know that I've got lots of stuff coming out of Build from different areas that I've got to take a look at. And it's kind of like, hopefully we'll get a bit of a reset this weekend and calm down a little bit and then go back in and be able to kind of chug along with life. I hope everyone has a nice, relaxing weekend wherever they may be.
Yeah, that's right. And all the best if anybody on this call or anybody in your business is nose to the grindstone, so to speak, with coming up to the end of our financial year. Going into June is a busy time for a lot of organisations that are trying to wrap things up before June 30. I would like to strangle the person who decided to put the school holidays in the very last week of June, because I know that adds a ton of stress as well. So all the best for the last month of our financial year, if that's something that impacts you.
Yes, and an election as well. Throw in an election just to stuff things around, particularly for some of our people who are working with governments.
Yeah, totally.
Always fun.
It's been a busy time. Well, we thank you for your time, for taking time out of your day to join Jess and I today. All the best. Take care. We will see you on the last Thursday of the month in June, where we come up with a topic and advertise it on LinkedIn and Twitter, and you can come and join us on what will be, she does a quick, the 30th. Thursday the 30th.
Oh, nice. June. The very last day. We can do like an end of financial year wrap up.
Watch this space. In the meantime, take care, look after yourselves, have a great month. Thanks for joining. Bye.
Thank you all.